This lecture series is part of a lecture endowed by Professor Ehsan Yarshater, a major figure in our field and really so much known that doesn't require that much introduction, but allow me just to use this time to say a few words about him. Professor Yarshater was born in 1920, and he was an Iranian historian and a very distinguished linguist, specialized with a lot of interest in Iran and Iranology. And he founded the Center for Iranian Studies, and Jacob Gevorgyan, Professor Emeritus. He was at Columbia University. Many people know that he was the Jacob Gevorgyan professor at Columbia. What people don't know, a lot of people don't know, is that he was the first Iranian who formally taught in a university in the United States after the Second World War. And what he really did, I can go on listing all the books he edited, and that included anything from Avicenna philosophy to general analysis of Persian language and legends and epics of kings, to actually rewriting. I remember myself being totally mesmerized by the little booklet that he published, which were a selection of the stories of the Shahnameh in Persian language. And one of the first things in prose, one of the first things I told him when I had the honor of meeting him was that, Professor Yarshater, I didn't think anyone would dare rewrite Ferdowsi in prose, but you did a fantastic job of it. And so we read his prose work of Dastanhai Shahnameh with my students for a long time. Of course, he was interested in history of painting, in Persian literature, of course, and the series that he edited. He also edited Cambridge History of Iran. As I said, I can just go on and on about what he did. I think one point I would really like to mention, although we try not to get into the nitty-gritty of their unhappy histories, was that despite the fact that his family suffered dramatically because of their religious orientation, I have never seen an individual who stayed so totally dedicated to his academic principles of what he wanted to say and do about Iran, despite the fact that actually the family had been put through a very difficult time. So he established this lecture series. His vision was that we will bring someone to stay, to be on board for a whole week and do a whole series of talks. It is more and more difficult to do that, but we are in conversation to see how we can make that vision come true. And he also wanted the results to be published, which we have been trying to achieve with not a great range of success so far. So with all that, we have a wonderful guest here that in a short time period, you'll find out that not only we are delighted to have him because he is such an influential and imaginative and really field builder as a part of the way we approach Persian literature, Professor Paul Losensky, but also because his life, as he told me, had a particular encounter in life with Professor Yarshater. So I am going to first say, Paul, you're most welcome. This is absolutely delightful to have you. And you, like Professor Yarshater, don't need that much description and introduction. Nonetheless, I'm going to invite my colleague, Professor Marjan Mousavi, our colleague in theater studies, who's about to make history in her own way. We are very much looking forward to that, to introduce Paul to our audience. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Keshavars. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Losensky. Dr. Paul Losensky is a professor in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he teaches Persian language and literature, comparative studies of Western and Middle Eastern literatures, and translation studies. His research focuses on Persian literary historiography, biographical writing, and Persian poetry of the early modern period. His publications include Welcoming Fighani, Imitation and Poetic Individuality in the Safavid Mughal Ghazal, 1998, Faidaddin Attar's Memorial of God's Friends, Lives and Sayings of Sufis, 2009, and the Bazaar of Love, Selected Poems of Amir Khosrow, 2013, with Sunil Sharma. He has authored numerous articles on Persian literature for journals such as Iranian Studies, and is a contributor to Encyclopedia of Islam and Encyclopedia Iranica. He is a former fellow at the National Humanities Center and has served as chair of the Department of Comparative Literature. Again, I'm very honored to welcome you, Dr. Losensky. Before our event begins, please take a moment now to make sure that your microphone is muted. Everybody, this event is being recorded with the permission of Dr. Losensky, and with the permission of Dr. Losensky, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. After the lecture is finished, we will hold a Q&A session. To ask your question, please either type in the chat box or use the raise hand feature located under the heading reactions in the bottom right corner of your screen. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Losensky. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint. Here, let me make sure I can do all of this. There it is. There we are. I can even. Okay. Well, this is my usual tracker. There it is. Okay. And off we go. So anyway, thank you. Good afternoon to all my listeners out there in Zoom land. It's a particular pleasure for me today to talk with you, especially as part of the Yarshater Speaker Series. As Dr. Keshavars has already indicated, I got to know Dr. Yarshater very well in the later years of his life. And in some ways, he's actually responsible for me addressing you here today. When I was still very green and untenured, Dr. Yarshater approached me about proposing and then writing a series of entries for Encyclopedia Iranica on Persian poetry from the 16th and 17th centuries, which is my main area of research interest. I dutifully drew up a list of poets and genres, and for about the next 5 or 6 years, I dove into the extensive reading in primary and secondary sources that was required to bring these kind of what looked like short entries into print. And along the way, I also met the best editor whom I've ever worked with, Ehsan Yarshater. And I slowly became the scholar that I aspired to being in graduate school. I can say this Encyclopedia Iranica project laid the foundation for all of my future research, really, including the talk that I'm going to present to you today. And I'll be forever grateful to Dr. Yarshater for his trust in a naive, somewhat goofy, and enthusiastic young professor with his freshly minted Chicago PhD. And I really am privileged to pay tribute to his memory here today. So let's proceed. In the afterword to his volume on the lives of contemporary poets, in his hometown of Kashan, the biographer Taqi Kashi reflects on the dilemma posed by writing biographies of people still living or recently deceased. If I refrain the tongue of expression from giving an account of the blameworthy qualities of some poets, which are blatantly obvious, then other associates who are informed of every detail of their circumstances will begin to reproach and reprove me, saying so-and-so's business in writing and composing is just happy talk and wasting time. But if the reality, the vrai, is really fil vrai spoken or written, the first group will be alienated and angry with my unworthy self and will unleash taunting and scornful tongues to utter whatever slander they wish. In short, I pass my days caught in a whirlpool of confusion and bewilderment. So to paraphrase, if Taqi tries to cover up the blatant vices of the poets he writes about, others who know these poets will reproach him for squandering their time with mere pleasantries and flattery. But if he writes about the reality of their shortcomings, the subjects of his biographies, the poets will take offense, stir up discord, and make him a target of their slander. Taqi is caught between a rock and a hard place, especially when the subjects of his biographies are poets, whom he generally considers a degenerate, envious, and malicious lot. His biography of the little-known poet Fahmi Kashani is ideal for examining Taqi authorial voice, the relationship between biographer and subject, and the ethics of life writing. Taqi is torn, as we shall see, between his admiration for Fahmi's considerable literary talent and his revulsion at his degenerate lifestyle. Nor can Taqi disguise his astonishment that Fahmi, despite his heretical leanings, is generously supported by a highly respected Sayyid. As Taqi tries to understand and fairly judge the poet's character, he also struggles to understand and judge his own, and is forced to confront his own limitations as a biographer. Fahmi's biography, moreover, opens a window on the larger poetic culture of 16th century Iran. Kashan was the center of the Persian literary world at the time, and Fahmi's small corpus represents all the major trends in non-narrative verse of the day. Although poetry was cultivated at all levels of society, Fahmi and many other skilled poets participated in a counterculture marked by loose sexual mores and doctrinally suspect religious beliefs and behavior. This counterculture found its voice in a distinct school of poetry, the Maktab-e-Vogu, which strove to describe the real-life Vogoui encounters between lovers. Fahmi's life story shows how the poetic subculture, despite its marginal status, was supported by members of the social, religious, and political elite. But before we get to Fahmi's biography, let's take a look at the work that contains it and its author. Taqi Kashi composed the biographical compilation and anthology, or Tazkireh, entitled Khulasat al-Ash'ar wa Zubdat al-Afkar, the summary of verses and the digest of thoughts. He composed this work over the course of 40 years, between 1567 and 1607, a life's work that earned him the nickname Mir Tazkireh, the Prince of Biography. This massive work, one of the largest Tazkirehs ever written, stands at the beginning of a tradition of life writing that would extend into the 20th century. In the 4 books or roken that make up the bulk of the work, the 4 books that make up the bulk of the work cover the entire Persian literary tradition, from its inception up to about 1540, and in roughly chronological order. In the Khatimeh, the final section of the Khulasat, Taqi turns to his contemporaries and the vibrant literary scene in Iran in the second half of the 16th century. In contrast to the chronological structure of the first 4 books, the Khatameh is organized geographically and consists of 12 chapters, each devoted to the poets of a particular Iranian city or region. The publishing house Miras-e Maktub began a project to publish all 12 chapters of the Khatameh back in 2005. The final volume on the poets of Hamadan was finally published just earlier this year, and a copy should be in my hands. May custom officials smile kindly upon the curious. Taqi ad-Din naturally begins the Khatameh with the poets of his hometown, Kashan. This volume contains life stories of 55 poets and ends with the brief afterword that I quoted from at the beginning of this talk. So with that background, let's now turn to the biography of Fahmi. Taqi begins his account of Fahmi's life with unrestrained praise for Fahmi's literary talent and achievement. Fahmi, Taqi tells us, is known among his peers and contemporaries for his knowledge of poetry and the fine points of poetic practice, or sha'iri. Through his assiduous imitation of ancient poetry and extensive reading in the work of his contemporaries, Fahmi has, quote, acquired a knowledge beyond description, close quote, of the literary art. Because of this single-minded focus on poetry, however, Fahmi, quote, has not worked much in the prevalent fields of scholarly study, close quote. Taqi does not specify which subjects make up the ulume mutadawwala, the prevalent fields of scholarly study, but they clearly include the religious sciences, since it is Fahmi's ignorance of them that leads him to follow the heretical teachings of the Noktavis, a sect actively persecuted by Safavid authorities. Fahmi's naivete is compounded by his innately free spirit or broad-mindedness, his vos'at-e mashrab, a complex character trait that I will discuss in greater detail in a couple of minutes. Taqi now introduces Fahmi's main supporter and patron, the Sayyid Mu'izz-e-Din Motahhar, with whom Fahmi, quote, lives out his days in luxury and honor. Sayyids, hereditary descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, constituted an elite status group in Safavid society. Their hereditary distinction, however, did not necessarily entail economic or political power. Some Sayyids worked as craftsmen or common laborers, but it did carry expectations of dignity, learning, and religious rectitude. Fahmi's patron, Mu'izz-e-Din Motahhar, moreover, was no ordinary Sayyid. Taqi describes him as, quote, exceptional and distinguished among the rest of the Sayyids and nobles of Kashan, close quote. Despite Fahmi's dubious religious leanings, he has a close relationship with his pious patron, much to Taqi's total amazement. Fahmi has accompanied Mu'izz-e-Din on numerous pilgrimages to the shrines of the Imams. Although his patron's influence has moderated Fahmi's deviant religious tendencies, it has not cured him of the other vices common among the tribe of poets, namely drinking and whoring. Second part of the quotation on the slide. Due to his natural laziness and his merrymaking mind with its songs of pleasure, and because of his indolence, inclination to the company of whores, and his constant and continual drinking cup after cup, such that he is stone drunk by night and hungover by day, he has no brain left for thinking. Otherwise, he would make the heart of many a poet turn cold to writing poetry. Taqi began his account of Fahmi's life with effusive praise for the poet's literary talent, but he closes this first section with a harsh condemnation of his dissipated and degenerate lifestyle. But as we will soon see, the very harshness of this critique will trigger a counter movement in the second section of the biography, where accusations against Fahmi lead his biographer, Taqi ad-Din, to reproach himself for this harsh and moralizing denunciation of the poet. But before we turn, I'm working all this suspense in here, but before we turn to the second section of the biography, we should situate it in the broader literary environment of 16th century Iran. Despite the usual narrative of Persian literary history, Safavid society was deeply engaged with the literary arts. Poetry was as much a part of social life as it was a form of verbal discourse. Safavid litterateurs assiduously collected, collated, and copied the literary archive of earlier centuries. Taqi ad-Din was only one of several writers who undertook to write the history of the Persian literary tradition in the form of a biographical anthology or tazkireh. Poetry circulated throughout all levels of society, and new poetry was produced at a staggering rate. The high cultural value of poetry led Taqi ad-Din to devote his life to its study and propagation. But despite his deep appreciation for the poetic art, Taqi has a generally low opinion of the character and moral laxity of the run of poets, and in particular, the habitués of the literary counterculture. Fahmi is far from the only poet that Taqi takes to task for his lifestyle and moral laxity. Taqi, for example, uses almost the same words to describe the poet Haydar Zahni as he does Fahmi. He began the study of the literary art, of the art of poetry, in the first days of childhood. Since his nature was most inclined to the lyric ghazal, during the period he was practicing poetry, he never opened his mouth to praise the notables of the time. Due to his mirthful temperament and free spirit, there's our vos ate mashrab, he wasted his time whoring, and his mind and bodily constitution did not work. Zahni adds to the list of poetic vices by spending most of his time playing cards and gambling away whatever money he has. Other poets have affairs with adolescent boys, apprentices in the marketplace, sometimes following them adoringly around the city or to other lands. So common is dissipation and debauchery among the ranks of poets that Taqi ad-Din seems genuinely surprised whenever he encounters a younger poet who does not indulge in these vices. To get a better nature of this literary counterculture, we can single out a couple of Taqi's key words. The first of these is vos ate mashrab or se'ate mashrab. In the most literal sense, the term means amplitude of character or temperament, breadth of character, perhaps. We might call this broad-mindedness, or as I have translated it here, free spirit. It is an ambivalent and sometimes dangerous character trait. On the one hand, it indicates an openness to multiple perspectives on the world and a receptiveness to new experience. It is often used to describe dervishes and other spiritual seekers, and is crucial to the poetic imagination. On the other hand, vos ate mashrab also indicates moral laxity, a nonchalant attitude to establish social norms and values. The free spirit is too easily led astray by manipulators, the latest fads, sexual temptations, and drug use. The second key word is lavandi. I have translated this term as whoring, but it refers more broadly to sexual promiscuity of every variety. The The historian Rudy Mattei has used the travelogues of European visitors to document the prevalence of sex work in Safavid Iran, from high-class courtesans to streetwalkers, both male and female. The master poet of the age, Mohtasham Kashani, provides an insider's view of this erotic subculture in two treatises of mixed prose and poetry, one narrating his affair with a culturally refined courtesan, and another his relationship with a pretty boy in service to a noble household. Much to Taqi ad-Din's chagrin, this demi-monde of sex, gambling, and drugs was also a hotbed of literary production, invention, and creativity. And for those who are interested, I've written about Mohtasham's two treatises in another article. So back to the talk. And by the way, I'm not big on illustrations for slides, but I couldn't resist this one for Lavendi. Anyway, let's turn to poetry. This counterculture was, in fact, the breeding ground of the major school of lyric poetry in the 16th century, the Maktab-e-Voghu. I have sometimes translated this term as the realist school, but the word realist brings with it associations with the realist novel of the 19th century and its exposés of economic and social injustices, an association that's not useful here. A better translation might be the poetry of the event, or the poetry of encounter. Maktab-e-Voghu refers primarily to a type of ghazal poetry that recounts the meetings between flesh and blood lovers, their clandestine courtships, their rivalries and jealousies, breakups, and rare moments of union. The poets of the Maktab-e-Voghu eschewed the mystical symbolism of earlier ghazal writers in favor of the encounters between humans, between human lovers in the here and now, with all their strange yearnings, behaviors, disappointments, and envy. So let's pause to consider a typical poem from this school by the poet Zehni, who I mentioned earlier. یا غیر را ز کوی تو آواره می کنم یا می کنم دل از تو و یک باره می کنم یا می ستانم از تو خط بند پروری یا خط بندگی تو را پاره می کنم تا چند هم ره تو توان دید غیر را فکری برای خویش در این باره می کنم یا می کنم علاج غم هجر و قرب غیر یا آنکه ترک وصل تو خونخواره می کنم ذهن به من بساز که پیدا شود رقیب درد دلی که هست تو را چاره می کنم I'll either send the other packing from your street or uproot my heart from you and have done with it. I'll either take from you a writ of tender care or rip to shreds my contract of service. How long can one watch the other together with you? This time, for once, I'll spare a thought for myself. I'll either cure our separation in the other's proximity or go on a bloody rampage to end our togetherness. Zehni, work with me to bring the rival to light. I can remedy the pain that you have in your heart. On the stage of this poem, the lover confronts a beloved whom he suspects of infidelity. The other, or the rival, are stock characters in Voghui ghazals, always lurking to thwart the lover's desire and to disrupt his relationship. In this encounter, the lover has had enough and bluntly threatens to end the relationship once and for all, a threat driven home by the repeated either-or sentences in 3 of the verses. Since the beloved has violated the terms of their relationship by entertaining other possible lovers, the lover, for once, will put his own well-being first. As often happens in the ghazal, another voice enters the poem in the final signature verse. It is the voice of an ally who offers to help the speaker Zehni to expose the rival and the beloved's infidelity. It might even be the voice of a new potential suitor who wins Zehni's affections by eliminating rival and beloved alike. Whatever the implications of this final line, this ghazal represents the fraught emotional world of the counterculture of erotic lavandi and its poetry. So, with a better sense of this larger literary environment, let's go back to Taqi ad-Din's biography of Fahmi. Taqi ends his disparaging portrayal of Fahmi's life by expressing his hope that the poet will reform his beliefs and behavior under the continued good influence of Sayyid Mu'izz-ad-Din and God's guidance. But no sooner does Taqi conclude his condescending call for Fahmi's moral reformation than he pulls up short and turns his critical eye back upon himself. This focus turns decisively from narrative to narrator. Taqi rebukes himself for his haughtiness and egotism in passing judgments on others. God, what is this haughtiness and egotism? What is this depravity and negativity that has flowed from the tongue of my pen? The soul of the heretic, that is, the writer of these words, is more evil than any evil that has been spoken or written. And this person, that is Taqi ad-Din, surpasses any baseness and deviance that has been described and recorded. When God himself generously hides and forgives the ugliness of human actions and the disgrace of secret desires, who is Taqi to cast blame on others? Such behavior arrogates God's role as the supreme judge. Taqi must now try to justify his own behavior, not Fahmi's, and resorts to a strangely similar defense. He was acting under the bad influence of others. Turning directly to his readers, Taqi explains, "Oh, dear reader, the custom and habit of scholars and poets these days has become such that they ascribe error and deviance to one another because of the envy that is implanted within them, and they attribute ugly deeds and disgraceful words to everyone due to the enmity and hypocrisy that is molded into their nature." Taqi, in short, suffers from the illness of his time, when the good and pious are as likely to be mocked as the evil and sacrilegious. His admiration for Fahmi's literary talent has slipped into a malicious envy. When such ethical contagion is so prevalent, tolerance becomes a vital survival technique. Indeed, Taqi writes, tolerating the unworthy is one of the attributes of God's grandeur. He goes on to give examples from the lives of the prophets Moses and Muhammad to show that everyone must endure the malicious slander of the ill-intentioned. Taqi directs this ethical remonstrance most obviously against himself, but his injunction to tolerate malicious talk might well be an appeal as well to Fahmi and Mu'izz-ad-Din to forgive their biographers' all too human failing. Following this digression, then, Taqi returns to the lives of both Sayyid and poet with a new attitude in the concluding section of the biography. As if to make up for any possible indiscretions towards this powerful man, Taqi first doubles down on his praise of Mu'izz-ad-Din. He is, quote, unique in the age and the cynosure of the time, and like the sun among the stars. Although it is hardly appropriate, Taqi says, to praise a Sayyid in the same breath as a poet, he cannot help himself, and he uses the amorous language of the ghazal to express the effect that the grace of a Sayyid like Mu'izz-ad-Din has on him. As he writes in a verse not on the slide, by day, I wonder how my heart will pass without you. By night, I worry how it will make it to the day. Remember, this is being addressed to a Sayyid. To close the biography then, Taqi returns to Fahmi's literary achievements, where he started. Fahmi is accomplished in all the poetic genres, writing lyrics, odes, quatrains, invectives, and even a little narrative verse. Fahmi has not yet collected his poetry into a single volume, but Taqi attributes this shortcoming not to Fahmi's natural laziness, indolence, or hard drinking, as he had earlier, but to his artistic insecurity. Fahmi, Taqi writes, does not have a great belief in his own poetry. But Taqi does, and the biography is followed by a generous selection of Fahmi's poetry. Whatever his opinion of Fahmi's character, Taqi takes it upon himself as the chronicler of the literary legacy of the age to provide a comprehensive anthology of the full range of Fahmi's work. In the end, Fahmi's literary talent trumps Taqi ad-Din's moral qualms. Like Taqi himself, Fahmi is a product of his time and environment, and his native gift for words redeems his susceptibility to the evil influences of his day and age. Taqi displays his own vos-at mashra, his broad-mindedness in his reassessment of Fahmi's character. And this change of heart is evident in Taqi's selection of Fahmi's poetry. Most of the dissolute poets of the counterculture composed only ghazals. Fahmi, on the other hand, wrote poems in all the recognized poetic forms. In addition to excerpts from 36 ghazals, Taqi includes 5 odes or qasides, a stanzaic tarki band, an invective against the poet Vahshi, quite an obscene one at that, and a sampling of roba'is and khates. Fahmi's qasides are addressed to various Safavid dignitaries and show a complete and a fluent command of the ritual language of praise and power. A full analysis of one of these odes would test your patience and the limits on my time, but let me offer a few verses from one of his qasidas in praise of the Shamlu governor of the province of Kashan. Gar fekanad ra'y to par to bar kainat, surat jan dar badan kur binad ayan. Shahr ke dar ve khatib khutbe be namat nakhanad, masjid adiniya ra khun ravad az navdan. آنچه خدا میدهد کس نتواند گرفت، خطه کاشان به تو داد خدای جهان. قهر تو گر با فلک دست کند در کمر، بگسلدش بر میان منطقه کهکشان. If your mind should cast its rays upon living creatures, the face of the soul and the body, the blind will plainly see. In the city where preachers do not give sermons in your name, blood runs from the gutters of the Friday mosque. That which God has given, no one can take away. The Lord of the world gave you the province of Kashan. If your wrath wrestles with the heavens by the belt, it will burst the girdle of the Milky Way. In the space of 4 verses, Fahmi identifies his patron's political status and praises both his intelligence and military might, which exercise their power over the cosmos and all living things. The second verse asserts the power of the state over religion. By denying the patron's authority transforms prayer into carnage. The absolute ideology here is reprehensible, but the image of blood running from the gutters sticks in the mind. Fahmy also shows a deft touch in that most ancient of Persian literary forms, the rubai. His quatrains deal with themes from love to obscene insult, but most often turn inward, encapsulating brief moments of self-reflection. In one of these, he depicts himself at home and alone in the company of a candle. آن شمع کز او خانه من روشن بود سر تا سر خانه ام از او گلشن بود گفت و شنودی نبود با هیچ کسش از شش جهت روی سخن با من بود. The candle that lights up my room turns all the room into a garden. It converses with no one else, but speaks to me from every corner. This personified candle provides a companion who is devoted solely to the speaker, without the threats of rivals or interruption or jealousy. In another rubai, the candle becomes the poet's alter ego. شب‌های فراق شمسان کاسته‌ام و شعله آه مجلس آراسته‌ام چون شعله آتشم نبوده است قرار صد بار نشسته و باز برخاسته‌ام. On nights of absence, I have wasted away like a candle. I have adorned the party with sighs of flame. Like fire's flame, I was unsteady. 100 times I sat down and got up again. Here, the speaker feels absence even in the midst of a party, and his restlessness leaves him unable to sit still, moving uneasily from place to place like the flickering flame of a candle. Fahmy uses one of the most common images in Persian poetry to evoke moments and movements of his emotional life. Fahmy, however, like most poets of the time, put most of his creative energy into lyric poems. Most of his ghazals fall clearly into the vogui mode, recounting his encounters with his beloved, lamenting his suffering, or rebuking his beloved's neglect and harsh treatment. There are even poems that reject the beloved outright, of the kind that we saw above in Zehni's ghazal. But Fahmy can also reject society at large. تنهایی از آن شعار کردم که از خلق زمان آر کردم از جور زمان بر تبتون آوارگی اختیار کردم هر بار که بر دلم نهادند برگردن صبر بار کردم نادانی من نگر که عمری بر غیر خود اعتبار کردم سر آبله زد زبان و انگشت از بس که بلا شمار کردم فهمی ز هجوم سنگ بیداد گردا گردم حصار کردم I made solitude my watchword, for I'm ashamed of the people of the age. Due to the age's cruelty, I chose to wander homeless while still in my native land. Every burden they laid upon my heart, I loaded onto the back of patience. See how ignorant I was to rely on anyone besides myself over a lifetime. My tongue and fingers grew blistered from counting off so many hardships. From the stones the unjust rained on me, Fahmy, I have built a fortress around myself. And one has to wonder whether Taqi ad-Din, his biographer, is not among those who laid burdens on Fahmy's back, on Fahmy's heart, and threw the stones that the poet built into his fortress of solitude. But Taqi does come to regret the stones that he threw in Fahmy's direction. And Taqi's biography of the poet depicts a critical moment of the biographer's own self-reckoning. Taqi admires Fahmy's talent to the point of envy, but is repulsed by his lifestyle. This ambivalence leads Taqi to tormented self-reflections and unresolved questions. Was Fahmi a knowingly committed heretic or a naive dupe of an accursed sect? Did Fahmi squander his talent in drink, or was he beset by self-critical doubt? What led to and sustained the personal relationship between two such disparate characters as Fahmi and Muizz-ad-Din? Taqi himself would be hard-pressed to answer these questions, and his biography of Fahmi becomes a parable of the limitations of knowing and judging the other. But Taqi ad-Din is not quite finished with Fahmi, and I'm not quite finished with you. The final biography in the first section of Taqi's volume on the poets of Kashan concerns Fahmi's son, named Ghazanfar, who predeceased his father in 1585. Ghazanfar was witty and intelligent and a skilled calligrapher, but like his father, he fell into bad company in, quote, the valley of whoring and frivolity, close quote. He developed what Taqi calls an obstruction of the liver, failed to follow medical advice, and died after 2 years. His death was memorialized in a short chronogram poem by the master poet of the age, no less than Muhtashem Kashani. A coda to this short biography offers further insight into the relationship between Taqi and Fahmi. After mourning his son's death for a suitable time, Fahmi comes to Taqi to tell him that his son Ghazanfar's dying wish was to be memorialized in Taqi's Tazkireh. Taqi accordingly takes on the task of recording, quote, in a suitable place, the fluently expressive verses and traces of Ghazanfar's jewel-setting stylist, which he left in scattered and dispersed jottings, close quote. There is an element of self-praise in this story, but this makes it no less plausible. Taqi had been working on Khulasat al-Ash'ar for over 30 years, and he talked to nearly everyone about it. But there is equally an element in this story of personal sympathy, as well as professional courtesy between biographer and subject. The biography of Ghazanfar epitomizes the balance between honest reporting and tolerance for human weakness, for which Taqi strives. Taqi Kashi's account of the life and works of his fellow townsman and poet Fahmi illustrates several patterns found throughout his writings on the poets of the time. Fahmi and Ghazanfar constitute only one of several father-son relationships in the Khulasat that explore the dynamics of kinship and social relation across generations. Fahmi and his son participate in a literary counter or subculture marked by sexual license, indulgence in wine and other intoxication, and the cultivation of the arts and poetry. While many denizens of this underworld come from the lower social classes, others are educated, talented, and highly cultured, and their behavior, in fact, enacts the scripts of the refined amorous ghazal, marked by clandestine romance, flouting convention, religious skepticism, and the moral latitude of Vos'at-e Mashrab. Although the early death of Fahmi's son shows the dangers inherent in living on the edge of proper society, this counterculture could only take shape in the context of the larger normative community. As Muizz-ad-Din's patronage of Fahmi suggests, members of the social elite had many links with this counterculture. Although Taqi ad-Din reproaches himself for even mentioning Sayyids in the same breath as poets, the two groups are in fact linked throughout his work, and slumming, as we used to call it, seems to have been a common practice among the wealthy and powerful. The poet and the Sayyid represent two necessary and complementary aspects of Safavid society. The social conditions of literary production are manifest in the poetic texts. A ghazal for Taqi ad-Din is a problematic genre. It is capable of expressing love for the divine, intimate friendship, or devoted respect, as we see in the verse that Taqi addressed to Muizz-ad-Din. But it can also reflect and give voice to society's darker side. As we've seen, the ghazal is the preferred genre of the literary subculture, and the Safavid demimonde of the 16th century gave rise to the sensual world of romantic trysts and betrayals depicted in the Maktab al-Wuqu, the poetry of the encounter. In Taqi ad-Din's eyes, what raises Fahmi above the average run of poets is his ability to write across the full range of genres. Here and elsewhere, Taqi ad-Din gives special consideration to those genres like the qasideh, hijah or invective, and the chronogram, the madiyya tariq, that perform the social functions of praising the honorable, condemning the deviant, and celebrating the events that define the larger community. In other words, lyric poetry is of less importance than these other forms of poetry that really do, that in Taqi ad-Din's eyes, do this kind of social work. So in addition to offering insights into the literary culture of the time, Fahmi's biography also illustrates Taqi's principles and practice as a biographer. The narrator's voice emerges forcefully when Taqi reproaches himself and addresses his readers directly, blurring the shifting line between biography and autobiography. Like the poets of the period, Taqi is committed to objectively reporting on the vuqu, or the vaqe, lived reality, however unpleasant it may be. At the same time, Taqi is aware of his own place in a network of social relations and of the limitations of his objectivity. He addresses these issues directly in the afterword. As a manifestation of his attributes of beauty and grandeur, Jamal or Jalal, God has created humans both good and evil. Poets, sadly, mostly belong to the latter group. As Taqi ad-Din puts it, a disorderly crowd who cannot tell good from bad and do not fear envy, rancor, wickedness, or evil, close quote. Yet as an embodiment of the range and variety of God's creation, they are to be excused, these poets, and stand far from the taunts of blame and reproach. Taqi continues, one cannot exaggerate and go on recounting the reproaches of this tribe of poets, for that would be boring. And one cannot write complaining of their words and manner, for that would be tedious. One must approach composing and writing their biographies with a steady heart, free of angry and malevolent thoughts, and a mind devoid of old resentments. Fahmi's biography enacts Taqi ad-Din's struggle to navigate the morally dubious lives of his subjects in a spirit of tolerance and equanimity, qualities that are as admirable and as difficult to act upon in our own time as they were in 16th century Iran. Thank you. Whoops. So
sorry, I started giving the talk without looking at. And let me just say, I just noticed that Dr. Mohsen Ashtiani is also with us. Welcome. There's a nice group of really people interested in Persian literature, and those who have, of course, had chances to know Paul's work. Let me just say that it is wonderful that you are shining the light on this period, which is not really taken that seriously. And if it is, it's very often and even it, focuses on certain areas and involves and ignores others. So thank you for that. I hope that last volume gets to you sooner rather than later. I have actually many questions.
These days, anyway.
Yeah. I have many questions. I can some of them send to you later, but I was wondering if, you know, when we read about Taqi from starting that time that, you know, he was given to wine and you know, his slaves kills him and, you know, that story around him. We have the same kind of attitude towards Manuchehri. He was always drunk, never saw the daylight. He died young. We have almost the same, although not exactly the same, about Ansari. Up to coming to Iraj Mirza, we are reading about how this amazing poetic talent, I mean, so many people say that, could have been so much more accomplished if only he hadn't been the kind of person who wasted his own talent and would have taken his own work more seriously. Do you think that some of this may be impacting Taqi ad-Din's? In other words, how much of what he does is based, do you think, on real encounters, which is, you know, that and what comes out of the information of the lives of Fahmi and Zehni and
Yeah, that's a good question, because obviously there is a history about it. I think part of what happens in the early modern period, which I'll use as a shorthand for the 16th and 17th centuries, but part of what happens is that poetry moves into the, and this goes back even into the Timurid period, poetry moves into the broader urban community. And so most of the poets that you were talking about, this all happened within a court context. So part of it, I think, is the fact that poetry has become more prevalent in society at large. The same old problems are there, but they're now kind of more recognizable because there are more people doing it, if you will. We also have plenty of evidence this kind of thing went on, not only from internal sources, but also, and here I'll credit Rudy Mattei again, also from the accounts of European travelers who are actually kind of amazed that, you know, that Esfahan is such a party town. And so I think that there's enough other sources of evidence to give us a clearly a fairly secure sense of the fact that this is that this is stuff that that was really happening. Yeah, and yeah, I can go on for as Fatima is well aware, I can go on for 20 minutes with any question. Other people.
Well, I see a couple of hands up. That's a great idea. Please put your hand up. Cam, can I come to you first? And please, oh, you did unmute yourself. Please go ahead, Cam.
Okay, thanks. Well, Paul, thank you so much for this talk. It's lovely to hear you speak and to share your latest work. And the thing I wanted to ask you about was your use of the word countercultural. That's an interesting term, and I was kind of curious to know more about why you're bringing it to the table, what kind of work it does for you. And the reason why it came to my mind is, or like one thing I might ask about in terms of like, what do you mean by counterculture, is that it's, I think, something we're still struggling to wrap our heads around as scholars. Is the sometimes apparent paradoxes or contradictions within a single poet's work. For example, like the flightings of Jarir and Farazdak, which seem to be antithetical to like their status as a courtly poet, or Domenico Ingenito's work on the obscene and Sadi made me think too of like, you know, the struggle to reconcile what seems to be like really outside the norm writings within the work of a otherwise well-established poet. So in that context, does countercultural fit within that broader reconciliation of praise and blame, shall we say? Or are you thinking of something more specific about the milieu of the Safavid period Iranian poets that you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah, good question. I mean, subculture, I'm always willing to entertain other terms. Subculture may have been better than counterculture. This is clearly a recognized, at least in Taqi ad-Din's eyes, and I think in the eyes of other kind of chroniclers of the time, this is recognized as kind of a group, as a particular, that literary crowd, as we might put it today, right? And so we have lots of poets who move in between. Muhtasham Kashani, we know him. You can't have a better court poet than Muhtasham. He wrote on every occasion. He was happy to provide panegyrics to basically anyone who ponied up the money. But we know that he also participated because we have these two treatises where he talks about his love affairs that take place within this world of kind of parties, of groups of admirers, of really, what do I want to say? Really, I probably threw it by too fast, but really people who tried to live the Ghazal lifestyle, right? They actually took those ghazals as kind of scripts for their own kinds of love affairs. So I'm not married to the term counterculture at all, but I want something to single out this particular kind of sphere of culture. You get a better sense of it when you read the Khulasat as a whole, because a lot of Taqi ad-Din did not just write about whoring drunkards, who also happen to write poetry, but he he gives us a portrait of how poetry played a role in the life of religious scholars, how poetry was integrated into any number of lifestyles. It's just that this particular lifestyle that I talked about today is the one that kind of comes out most strongly. Now, a fuller picture of where this sits would require this broader view that we can in fact get from Taqi ad-Din of all the different ways poetry was worked into people's lives. Does that get to your question?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Ahmed, would you please go ahead?
Yes, first of all, Paul, thanks so much for this wonderfully intertwined account of Taqi ad-Din and Fahmi, the account of the poet ensconced beautifully into the account of the biographer, and then with the larger poetic context around it. So I learned a lot. As you were talking halfway through, I was wondering, the usual question about audience and who the audience of Khulasat was. And but then I think by the end of your account, I began to think that your very fine account of the balancing act that Taqi ad-Din performs between the Sayyid, the patron, and then the poet, and then himself, began to make me think that perhaps the audience basically is the combination of all these producers and consumers of poetry who perhaps are to be found in different subcultures, perhaps to use that word, but the subculture of poetry infuses these different milieus of poetic appreciation. And then your account of Taqi ad-Din made me think that he's keenly aware of the ways in which he has to please all of them. And he has to also be truthful to the scene as a whole. So am I right in perhaps understanding that particular reading of Tazkireh as a beautiful location for analysis of the social, shall we say, again, location of poetry, because I had not thought about Tazkira that way before. So
yeah, that's a great question. And there's a big difference between the Khatame, which is really just one of the most fascinating things you can ever read. And sometimes I feel like it's like a novel with poetry. You get this cast of weird characters with this really strong narrative voice and weird little connections that come up between them. And the fact that in the Khatame, Taqi ad-Din knows the people that he's writing about. The first part, the major part of the Tazkira is much more boring stuff, really. You know, it's kind of, it's best known for, first of all, it contains more verses than any other Tazkira. And it was clearly important for kind of propagating the work of some of these earlier poets. So Taqi ad-Din was one of these people who was involved very much in recovering the past, putting it in new forms. And that a lot of that happens in these first 4 volumes. In fact, some poets we know almost primarily from the material that Taqi ad-Din provides. The most distinctive feature of those biographies, of the biographical part of those first 4 volumes, is the fact that he makes up love stories for everybody. There is no poet who did not get involved with somebody sometime as a life-changing experience. But it's really the latter part. It's really where he's writing about the poets that he knows or have heard about second or first hand. That's where the stuff gets really entertaining. And that's where you get this sense of poetry could be recited. They had what we would call salons, right? Poets would get together with one another and their audience was one another, right? But there's clearly also a large community of wealthy patrons, whether they're sayyids or merchants or top-level bureaucrats or one thing or the other, who are also paying these guys for poetry. It's a very, what do I want to say, just like being a rock musician, it's a very unstable form of income. And sometimes I think of Vaugeois poetry really as kind of pop songs. They start to sound alike after a while, but every once in a while you get one that's just like an ear, you know, an ear bug that crawls into your head. So it's good stuff. And especially the volumes on Kashan, Esfahan, and I'm so happy Hamadan is finally coming out, because we know he spent time in those 3 cities. And so it's the stuff that comes from the cities where he actually lived for a few years that get very dynamic in terms of audience writer interaction. And you know, these would have circulated in partial copies. They would have circulated. We learn a lot about how poetry circulated actually from where Taqi ad-Din gets his poetry, because he'll tell us, you know, I got these verses by this guy from my friend so and so, or the poet himself sent me a selection of his verses. So we get a good sense of how poetry circulated, shall we say, before print. And that sort of thing, when not very many people could afford full manuscripts of anything.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Yeah, I talked around your question long enough.
No, that's lovely. Thank you for addressing these, and I actually have follow-up questions on that, but let me just let Austin ask first. I have had my chance once, so Austin, please welcome and go ahead.
Hello. So thank you so much, Paul. This was really interesting and made me think about a lot of things. So my question, I was wondering if there's any more that you could tell us sort of about the relationship between the Sayyid, Amir Mu'azz-ed-Din and Fahmi. Just the reason I'm asking this is, you know, normally when I think of relationships between poets and powerful people, I mean, the first thing I think is that, you know, they were patrons. But I felt like you were maybe suggesting that at least among the Qasidays that we have, maybe some weren't they were addressed to governors, but were any addressed to the Sayyid? And yeah, I was just interested in this. Do we know, is it's sort of a fun guy to have around? Are there any other sources? I was just struck by that. So
yeah, you actually took the words out of my mouth. I think he was a fun guy to have around. He doesn't write poems, to at least, and really what we have is what Taqi ad-Din includes, right? There, he, as he quite rightly says, he didn't collect his poetry into a divan, into a single volume. And we have there's a qasida that is written to Ismail II. There's a couple of qasidas to viziers and that kind of thing, but none addressed to a Sayyid or to a religious scholar. And I really do think that probably what Fahmy was kind of a witty guy to have around. He, I don't know, gave the Sayyid kind of a small entree into this, into the way these people lived. I imagine he was a general gopher. Some of these poets who kind of were attached to a household did a lot of other things besides write poetry. They were kind of handy to have around to, check your spelling, whatever. But I suspect there's something very similar to being kind of a personal secretary in some of these relationships. Probably not with a degenerate like me, but yeah, I mean, in many ways, it's and Taqi ad-Din himself is totally baffled by this, and you can tell he never really kind of figures it out for himself. So again, we can draw on patterns that we get from other biographies that begin to form as you read through these. There are a number of these kinds of what seem to be casual poet-patron relationships where the poet is yeah, he's probably, he's a witty bon vivant, but is probably also doing other things, but we don't get that kind of detail.
Thank you, Paul. See that lots of thoughts are generated and questions around your fantastic talk. There's a question by, I'm sorry, can't see your face clearly. Quasar, could you please?
Hi, folks. This is, you may know me better by my translator's name, David Martin.
Oh, Dave, you translated Sepehriz Hajm Sabs.
Yes, Furuh Faraksad, or Attar, Molano, Sadi, or Hame.
Right. Perfect. Sorry, David, I couldn't see you.
I apologize for the light. This is very interesting, and thank you so much. This is an area that I was rather much blank on for the most part. But it brings to mind comparisons between, say, Abu Nuwas, the great Arab Abbasid poet, and even earlier times right after the Prophet's death in Medina, the lifestyle there. But there's a much larger question here, which I'd like to bring up, which is something I think many people have been struggling with for a very long time, which is how to separate, or can we separate, to what extent should we separate an intellectual or a poet or a scientist's lifestyle from his or her intellectual artistic production. I will take, for example, Roman Polanski, right? Filmmaker, Ezra Pound, okay? Famous for his support of fascism in Italy. And then even Johannes Kepler, who was rather much been confirmed as being the murderer of his scientific mentor. I've forgotten his name, the Danish fellow. from whose all his data he used for setting up his theory of the orbits of the planets around the sun. This is very, very troubling. You know, we rather much pass off Kepler because he was such a long time ago, but have you thoughts on this, and how have you thought about other people's thoughts about this?
Okay, I'm never one to draw a direct connection between a poet and the work that they produce. Ezra Pound was a fascist. I also happen to think he was probably the greatest stylist, poetic stylist in the mid-20th century, writing in English. His command of words and things I just find absolutely mesmerizing.
I agree with you. I agree with you totally.
Yeah, and so the fact that he had, you know, the fact that he had those political beliefs it doesn't keep me from reading the poetry, or from appreciating it, or from trying to figure out why he had those beliefs. Actually, in many ways, he saw Italian fascism as the answer to, you know, to economic disparity. And, you know, so anyway, I don't want to get into Pound too deeply. But I think, you know, I have kind of the attitude, I've adapted the attitude of Taqi ad-Din at the end of the biography, which is, you know, tolerance, equanimity, let's see what kind of art they produce, and really focus on that. And that's part of the reason I find that biography so enchanting, is precisely that. Yeah, I think he was a lowlife. You know, look what happened to his son, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, the two seem to have been closely acquainted, to judge from the fact that Fahmy went and presented this final request to Taqi ad-Din. And yeah, and I think, you know, I think that at least I personally take the sort of a very vosate mashrab kind of approach to this thing, which is, if the poetry works, if the art works, you know, I can forgive a lot, especially if the person's already dead and not immediately in my life. So sorry, but yeah, I didn't have to deal with Ezra Pound as a personality or as a political figure, and so I suppose there's a certain grace to that. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's certainly a great one.
Well, I just open this up to everyone. It's something that I'm constantly struggling with, and I tend to step back and say, let's look at the art, let's look at the science. How much does this contribute? Yeah, but I am troubled, and I have not come to terms with my being disturbed about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
That's all right. Jamalu Jalal.
Right. Yes. Both. Yes, or Khof and Raja. You know, there could be both. But that actually addresses something that was on my mind, as both Ahmed was talking with you, and this last question that David asked. And that's poetic self-image. You know, you have you know, Saadi, and you have Attar, you know, you know, you know, I never wrote, you know, in praise of anyone. Or Saadi, همه قبیله من عالمان دین بودن، مرا معلم عشق تو شاعری آموخت. So it's just presenting themselves as the poets who they are. So one of my questions is that, is there a way to, of course, from this biography, we're getting Kashani rather than the poets themselves, but is there a way to build that such a poetic self-image for the period, from at least the works of Fahmy and Zehni that you have been dealing with? I'm aware that it's a much wider range, and that wasn't what you were, you know, intending to do. But I'm wondering if a poetic self-image emerges from their works?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wouldn't want to, in most of the cases, probably not really. Fahmy is, he's a incredibly skilled wordsmith.
Mhm.
Doesn't strike a distinctive literary personality, really, especially from the small sampling of his work that we have. But what I have been looking at a lot lately is kind of the emergence of what I would call autobiography is not exactly the right word, but writing one's own life. And you see all through the 16th century, everybody talks about the emergence of the Tazkireh, right, as being this interest in biography and in individual life stories. I think there's also a movement like that going on in poetry. So you have Muhtashem Khashani, again, to go back to his two treatises on his love affairs, presents them as autobiographical. I mean, we don't need to take that seriously or how seriously we take it, but he says that this is what happened to me. So at least we have the pretense of biography. If we look at, of autobiography, if we look at Zohuri Torshizi, poet who ended up working in the Deccan for the most part, his Sahiname is really a poem about his career as a court poet. He recounts how he entered the service of his patron, how he was originally rejected, and then how he gained thing, and then how he got rich, and how he had then this moral crisis. Am I only writing poetry to get rich? And then kind of has this sort of, no, I'm a poet, I know the wisdom of the ages, right? But it's this story of his kind of mental trajectory from court poet to sage poet, if you will. Again, there's a lot of this that's going to be very conventional, but there are a lot of cases in this period where you're seeing poets who are bringing increasing amounts of what they consider, of what they consider or intend to present as real life experience, right? So it's and again, it's hard to tell where Taqi ad-Din, where the biographer gives way to the autobiographer, right? Because he also writes a lot about himself as he's writing about these other poets. And so it seems I'm still kind of trying to get it down exactly, and collect all this material that I've sort of encountered kind of randomly, and to pull it all together. But I think this is an age where poets are beginning to consciously try and do self-portraits. So yeah, and and Soeb is he always at the end of so many ghazals, he tells you where he is. I wrote this, I'm in India, I'm in Kashmir, I'm in Isfahan. And so you get these toponyms that kind of serve as a way of mapping the poet's life.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And to separate these from the conventional kind of horizons of each genre, what you're supposed to say about yourself and not supposed to say. And part of the reason why I started thinking about this is also that they have poets of this period appear to be, at least, I mean, I'm being very general about this. It's not an area I have done specific research in, but names like Fahmi, Zehni, Khamushi, it looks like you are presenting a self-image. I'm hoping that somebody will, take this area and does a specific study of seeing how these people are trying to present themselves. Let me see if there are any other questions from the floor. Yes, there is one more for you there, Paul. We'll soon let you go. I know you've been talking for an hour and a half now, but that's okay.
I wouldn't be in a hurry if it was raining outside.
Okay, then Ahmed, you just, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to follow up quickly on this whole point about self-image and all that. I mean, among historians broadly, not just literary historians, but especially perhaps all other kinds of cultural historians, there is this kind of a emerging consensus that the early modern, or perhaps the later parts of early modern period, especially 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, is full of this increasing awareness of being a subject on the part of especially those who produce texts. So the example from my neck of the woods is basically hagiographies.
Right.
And we have an increasing number of saintly figures writing hagiographies of themselves. So it's like,
drawing your own halo.
Exactly. So that fits in perfectly well with the idea of, a poet developing their own self-image consciously and deliberately in their own poetry. And it would be something really, I think, useful for all of us to somehow keep that in mind as a broader societal cultural development and ask the reasons. And there are, of course, speculations about that, but I just wanted to make that point. So it's not
great. Thank you. And I completely endorse your idea of looking at how, because it's a thing. It's a thing in English poetry of the time. It's a thing in Spanish poetry of the time, where authors are kind of drawing more and more on personal experience and either fictionalizing it or not, dressing it up. But but yeah, and I love the idea of writing my own hagiography.
Yes,
I'll be sure and send you all a copy. How great. Yeah, there is a St. Paul.
Yeah. Oh yes. And Paul, just to follow up on the issue of Takhallos, the name.
Right.
When I was, as a younger fan of these poets, was reading, and I really enjoyed Sabke Hindi. I was always wondering why Vahshi called himself Vahshi, Vahshi Bafri. And, he writes some of the finest, softest, kindest kinds of ghazals, but he's Vahshi Bafri. And it's really a good thesis there, somewhere there, for people to start looking at these. I mean, as I said, I have tons of other things, but I think we can get to them because some of them, the nitty gritty of those are kind of things that maybe I shouldn't be bothering everyone with, but thank you so much. I've been thinking, as we were talking about these, I was thinking, what would Dr. Yarshater say if he was here with his encyclopedic, vision of Persian literature, that he would be able to contribute so many things to this conversation. And it is due to his kind and generous gift that we are able to do this and bring a community of literature lovers and Persian culture and investigators, lovers, scholars together to learn from each other. And we learned a lot from you today, Paul. Thank you.
Great.
So very much.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming.
Yes.
Yes. But I look forward to seeing all of you in 3D one day very soon.
Yes, so I promise you, Paul wasn't that keen on Zoom. Let me tell everyone. So Paul, I promise you, the first time when you're back from your travels, we will be occasions where we will see you in 3D and hope to see you in 3D. And I'm sure.
My one thing though, and I always wanted to suggest to a Zoom developer, you need canned applause at the end of the talk. It's so weird to finish a talk and be met with dead silence.
Yes. No, I mean, it's one of the
track too.
It's like it's one of the gifts of COVID but it has its goods and bads. I mean, on some
Yeah.
level, we just
Nope.
get people from everywhere. That's
There you
fantastic.
go. I'm seeing people that I wouldn't see otherwise. So there you go.
Exactly. On the other hand, yes, it does have its limits. And on that point, thank you all very much for
Thank you.
clicking in and coming in and joining us, and look forward to see you all in
Bye-bye,
the
everyone.
presentations.
bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And
Thank you.
everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.
You too.
Bye. Bye.